presenter for the next paper will be Roberta Romano, who's at Harvard Law School. And with that, please take it away. And
okay, great. Thank you. This is joint work with Lucian Bebchuk and Kobe Castiel, who are here. We'll take some questions. Lucian will do the easy and medium difficulty one, Kobe the toughest. The paper is called For Whom Corporate Leaders Bargain, and the motivation behind this is the current heated debate around stakeholderism or stakeholder governance, which is the view that corporate leaders should be given discretion to take into account the well-being of stakeholders as an independent end when they make business decisions. There have been a very classic work supporting this view in the 80s and 90s, and some recent prominent authors advocating this view. Prominent business groups, like most notably the Business Roundtables in 2019 with their statement on the purpose of the corporation, the World Economic Forum in Davos, several letters of Larry Fink to BlackRock portfolio company CEOs, urging companies embracing purpose, and recently also the ongoing project of the restatement of corporate governance by the American Law Institute is considering the introduction of some stakeholderist elements in the restatement. So it's an important debate. On the other end of the debate, there is an agency critique. Lucian and I have a paper last year, The Illusory Promise of Stakeholder Governance, where we examined the incentives that directors and CEOs face. And we conclude that they should be expected not to produce meaningful benefit for stakeholders if they are given the discretion to do so. And at the core of this dispute, there is an empirical question. What would happen if we gave directors this broad discretion to take into account stakeholder interests as independent ends? Would they use this power to produce benefits for stakeholders or not? And this paper tries to answer this question by testing it in a setting that is particularly useful for resolving the dispute. Private equity acquisitions of companies incorporated in states with a constituency statute. As you know, these statutes were adopted in a majority of US states in the 80s and early 90s, and they authorized directors to consider the interests of stakeholders, not just of shareholders, when they assess acquisition offers. And private equity acquisition are a very good example of transactions that pose significant risk to shareholders because they move assets into the hands of asset managers with very powerful incentives to maximize shareholder values. So we test this as an experiment of stakeholderism to see what outcomes it produced. We constructed a database of acquisition by private equity firms of target companies incorporated in states that had a constituency statutes at the time of the deal. Transactions are announced between 2000 and 2019, so 20 years of private equity deals. We excluded deals below 50 million in 2019 dollars. And our final sample includes 110 transactions with targets incorporated in 17 different states with constituency statutes. We hand collected and hand coded information from the proxy statements for the merger filed by the company and the final merger agreements, which contain all the detailed contractual terms. So we collect information about the bargaining process leading to the transaction and the final terms of the deal. So first of all, we found that corporate leaders engage in substantial bargaining and negotiation. And this is a lengthy and fruitful process because in 78% of the cases, the final terms in the merger agreement are better for the target company than the initial offer. It's a process of particularly long, 194 days on average. There are, in many cases, offered by other parties, which creates, of course, pressure on the buyers. There are discussion with other parties in almost 90% of the cases, and multiple offers by the final buyer. So corporate leaders negotiate these deals and obtain improvements during this process. But for whom did they bargain? For whom they obtain these benefits? This is the key question of the paper. And I'll examine briefly the various groups. So shareholders obtain substantial premia over the pre-announcement stock price unaffected by information about the deal. So 30% is the average premium for the entire sample, 25 the medium, and the top 20 largest acquisition, it's 23% the average premium. So substantial benefit for shareholders. And executives get significant financial payoffs as well, both as shareholders because they own stock in their own company, and as executives, so transaction bonuses, additional payments, and also the promise. Sometimes it's a formal commitment, sometimes it's an announcement to retain them in the new company, so after the transaction. So there are substantial gains for shareholders and executives, but what about stakeholders, which was the purpose of stakeholder statutes? Employees are the most important group. They are explicitly identified by all constituency statutes governing our transaction, the transaction in our sample, as a protected stakeholder group. And private equity acquisitions pose a clear risk for them. Davis et al., a paper 2019, they found that private equity acquisitions are followed by a reduction in employment. But corporate leaders made very little use of their bargaining power and their discretionary power under the constituency statutes to negotiate constraints on the buyer to fire employees. In 97% of the cases, there's no such contractual clause. And the only protection we found in many deals is a transitional period, a one-year period, where the buyer cannot change the salaries and benefits of the employees that it decides to retain, but it is not obligated to retain those employees. And after the 1 year, it can get rid of them. And importantly, in no cases, these protections are enforceable by the employees. They're not party to the merger agreement, and these contracts typically include a clause excluding enforceability by third-party beneficiaries. The other stakeholders group, the situation for them is even worse. Customers, suppliers, and creditors are recognized by a vast majority of constituency statutes governing the deals in our sample, but we found virtually no cases where corporate leaders negotiate protections for them. Communities, environments, and other stakeholders, the situation is similar. No contractual protection at all. In a small number of deals, there's some soft commitment to keep the headquarters in the same location where it is before the deal, but it's a very vague commitment. There's no specific definition of what the headquarters means in particular, some definition in terms of assets or number of employees or other criteria to check the compliance with this commitment. And importantly, this is not enforceable, once again, by third parties. It's not like the local community, local residents, or the mayor can sue the buyer if it decides to move the headquarters to another place. So it's mostly a cosmetic provision in a small number of deals. So what do we learn from this experiment? So the main conclusion is clearly that the constituency statutes failed to deliver their promised benefits for stakeholders. But we are also interested in something, in what we can infer and learn from this experiment for stakeholderism in general. Constituency statutes have a very similar approach to what modern advocates for stakeholderism support. Which is this harnessing the discretion of corporate leaders in order to protect stakeholders. So before embracing stakeholderism, it is necessary, we believe, to examine and to understand why the constituency statutes experiment failed. So in the paper, we examine 5 possible explanations of why this is the case. I will just highlight the most important. So, but we conclude that the most likely driver is that corporate leaders' incentives are such that they should not be expected to produce any benefits for stakeholders. So they have incentives to not to benefit stakeholders beyond what is instrumentally useful for shareholders and shareholder interests. So one of the main possible objection could be that maybe corporate leaders did want to negotiate some benefits for stakeholders, but since target shareholders need to approve the deal, they anticipated this and they refrained from doing this because otherwise shareholders wouldn't have approved the deal. We think this is unlikely because most deals have substantial premiums for shareholders, and there is room. There would have been room for buying some benefits for stakeholders at the expense of a small fraction of the premium. And also deals approved by the widest margins, they have no better protections than other deals. So we find this an implausible explanation. And in any case, if this is true, if this were true for constituency statutes, it would be true also for stakeholderism in general. There is no concrete stakeholderist proposals that suggests to disenfranchise shareholders or to modify voting rights for shareholders. It's not like the Business Roundtable statement says that shareholders shouldn't approve mergers or other important decisions that right now they have voting rights on. Some other observers might say, and they say that norms are changing, and for decades, shareholder-centric corporate norms have shaped corporate leaders' decisions, but now this is changing, and stakeholderism would change it even further. But we find this unlikely too because we looked at a subsample of most recent deals from 2017 to 2019, and despite the rampant stakeholder rhetoric, we find no meaningful difference in terms of stakeholder protections. So we don't believe that corporate leaders alone can shape this. So our conclusion is that the incentives of corporate leaders, the most important factors explaining our results. Constituency statutes did give corporate leaders discretion to negotiate for stakeholders, but they did not change their incentives to do so. So they had and continue to have incentives not to serve stakeholders. A couple of, before concluding, a couple of points that clarify some aspects of our study. First of all, we studied sales in states governed by constituency statutes, but we did not study sales in other states without constituency statutes. And the reason is that the hypothesis we are exploring is that the discretion provided by constituency statutes, whether this discretion improved the terms of the mergers for stakeholders. So in order to show this, we need to show two things. First, that in transactions governed by constituency statutes, there are significant stakeholder protections. And then we should show that these protections are greater or more meaningful than those found in similar deals in states without constituency statutes. But since we do not find anything to show that the first element is there, we do not find any meaningful protections under constituency statutes. The conclusion is already evident. We saw no need to do any comparison because we found virtually zero protections in the treatment, if you will, group. Another point, another comment that we got in the past is that maybe maybe constituency statutes are helping stakeholders through a different channel. They are corporate leaders are using the power under constituency statutes to reject deals that would have been bad for stakeholders. So through this channel, there will be some benefits for stakeholders. But this is implausible in our view, because what happens where a company receives a private equity offer for an acquisition, which produce overall efficiency gains, so which is good for shareholders, but in the hypothesis is bad for stakeholders. They could certainly reject it, but this would be bad for shareholders as well. But they could also negotiate a redistribution of some value from shareholders to stakeholders and still keep the efficiency gain overall and make both groups happy. And since we found no meaningful instances of stakeholder protections, we find it implausible that there are several or even many instances where corporate leaders use this discretion to turn down offers that would have been good for shareholders but bad for stakeholders. So our conclusion is that this experiment and the failure of this experiment must serve as a warning for advocates of stakeholderism and for the idea that we should rely on the discretion of corporate leaders to protect stakeholder interests. They had the chance to do so in many states for now almost 4 decades in some states. They had the power to do so in M&A deals. And when we looked at 20 years of this activity, we found no meaningful protection. So the available evidence does not provide a basis for expecting that discretion-based stakeholderism would benefit stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Our discussant is René Stulz from Ohio State.
Many thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper. This is a great paper. It provides a lot of food for thought. So I will have a number of observations. The paper is forthcoming, so I'm going to stay away from the weeds and take a more high-level perspective. Now, this is about stakeholderism, the 2020 or 21 version. But we have had those discussions before most of us were born. And in 1932, Merrick Dodd, a Harvard Law School professor, like the authors, wrote a paper titled "For Whom Are Corporate Managers Trustees?" And so the title is quite similar to the one we have here. And the authors in this paper want to say that corporate managers are essentially trustees for themselves and the shareholders. The Merrick Dodd paper responded to a paper by Burl, which argued for kind of the shareholder view, shareholder maximization view that has been prevalent. But Dodd, in his article, says he believes that public opinion, which ultimately makes law, has made and is today making substantial strides in the direction of a view of the business corporation as an economic institution, which has a social service as well as a profit-making function. In many ways, that describes at least some versions of stakeholderism. It probably describes it well, the Davos view of stakeholderism. Now, Klaus Schwab, the leader of Davos, wrote an article explaining the Davos manifesto. And in that article, he says that stakeholder capitalism positions private corporations as trustees of society, and is clearly the best response to today's social and environmental challenges. And then he asks, why is it that the attitudes have begun to change? And he attributes that to Greta Thunberg. And then he says that business leaders now have an incredible opportunity. By giving stakeholder capitalism concrete meaning, they can move beyond their legal obligations and uphold their duty to society. So you can see in the duty to society, it's a continuity from the 30s to 2020 in terms of this stakeholderism. So the paper addresses what does it mean, what does stakeholderism mean in practice? And BKT have a test to distinguish between shareholder wealth and maximization and stakeholderism. Now they describe it as a stakeholderism view holds that the welfare of each group of corporate shareholders is relevant and valuable independent of its effect on the welfare of shareholders. One way to think about this is that for the authors, it is not stakeholderism if it doesn't hurt shareholders in some states of the world. But you can think of optimal policies for shareholders that exposed are costly to shareholders. And so I think it's a little bit, the condition has to be a little bit more complicated. Now you can think of a lot of things that can be optimal, where it can be optimal for shareholders to put a high weight on stakeholder welfare. And the paper that we just heard from Philip would be evidence of that. Now, if we take it at face value, that you pay less if you have some policies that favor stakeholders, now you have lower wages, then you might be maximizing shareholder wealth. Now, in general, with costly and incomplete contracting, a corporation can create value for shareholders through commitments to stakeholders. Now, for instance, it can make costly investments to create a reputation of fair dealing. Obviously, to build such a reputation, you have to take actions that at the time are costly for shareholders. Now, BKT kind of dismiss this or don't want to consider it, calling it a form of enlightened shareholder wealth maximization, and they say that's not stakeholderism. I think the distinction is between the two is probably not as sharp as they want to make it. So in their papers, they want to put stakeholderism to the test they have defined. They want to investigate whether corporate leaders, when permitted or asked to do so, give up shareholder dollars to benefit stakeholders. They focus on a very specific type of transactions, PE acquisitions. They construct a fantastic database. Now they have to be commended for that, as well as for writing a very interesting paper. The paper only works in the US setting. In the US setting, states have adopted various statutes that creates obstacles to hostile acquisitions. There are many papers written on the impact of those statutes. But one type of statute is less studied than the ones that more directly impede hostile acquisitions. The Constituency Statutes, they're also called directors' duties laws. These laws permit directors to consider the welfare of stakeholders. So BKT look at states where those laws are in effect to see whether corporate leaders bargain in favor of stakeholders. They motivate their focus on PE acquisitions by saying that there is evidence that PE acquisitions endanger the welfare of stakeholders, as some of the value created may come from breaking implicit contracts. However, they are kind of a strange acquisition to look at, because now those acquisitions that create value precisely because they enable a fundamental restructuring that would be hard to achieve in public markets. Now, the typical PE acquisition will take the firm private. And by definition, now fundamental restructuring of firms are going to involve changes for stakeholders. And those changes are in some sense a component of the values that is being created. So you worry about a selection bias, no, which is that the corporate leaders who choose to respond to a PE acquisition offer or generate such an offer have already decided that this is how value can be created. They may have decided that the current way the corporation is functioning is not sustainable, and something has to be done to change. Now, those PE acquisitions sometimes come exogenously to the firm, but often they are generated by management itself. And so those leaders who generate such an acquisition offer obviously are already committed to creating values that way. And so it's really hard to think that if the corporate leaders have chosen to go the PE route, that then they would want to restrict the discretion of the acquirer to create the values that they see by a fundamental restructuring. And so in some sense, it's a setting when one is least likely to see corporate leaders try to protect stakeholders. The authors focus on whether they can find explicit contracts, but writing contracts to protect stakeholders seems to be really hard to do. Now that they are all lawyers, so they know better than I do, but certainly from the perspective of financial economists, it would seem to be hard to do. Hard to do in such a way that it doesn't reduce flexibility in a way that would hurt stakeholders in the long run. But now, obviously, there could be discussions about stakeholders who will be treated. And in many of the acquisitions, there are multiple bidders. And so the PE acquirer might, the target or the acquired firm may choose a PE acquirer that is more stakeholder friendly than another, or might have implicit commitments. So we don't know about that. Now, it may be that it doesn't make sense to think that this would be taking place, but it would be nice to see what the authors have to say about that. They have this agency view. Now, Roberto talked about their earlier paper. And the view is really that corporate leaders benefit from increasing shareholder wealth. So they are not going to use their discretion to benefit stakeholders at the expense of shareholder wealth. To me, that seems a little bit naive as kind of a general proposition. Now, the corporate leaders operate in a world where they are affected by culture, social networks, politics. Actions that are acceptable in some countries at some time may not be acceptable in the same countries at other time. Corporate leaders often like to be popular, like to be praised, like to have their actions be socially acceptable. And they may also choose a path of least resistance. And now here is an example of things changing. The person in the middle is Jamie Dimon. And And now kneeling like that for the non-American was kind of a symbol of the BLM movement, and he participated in that. Now, choosing the path of least resistance now is something that's easier in the states with anti-takeover statutes. And now, to me, one of the most important papers on the impact of those anti-takeover statutes is the Bertrand and Muller-Nathan paper in QJE. Okay, their claim is that these statutes make it possible for corporate leaders to enjoy a quiet life. They show that as a result, among other things, wages are higher. Okay, now this could be a good thing, but it also suggests that it opens the door to inefficiency, which may be bad for stakeholders in the long run. Okay, and so there is more evidence on constituency statutes than and there is an interesting paper by Flammer and Kapocek, which argues that those statutes lead to a significant increase in the number of patents and citations per patent. And kind of the argument is that those statutes allow management to focus on the long run, that it's more easy for firms to experiment when they have that kind of protection. An interesting paper by Kramers, Guernsey, and Seppi argues that Tobin skew increases with the passage of constituency statutes, so value increases. And there is a paper recently that is forthcoming by Gao, Li, and Ma, saying that those statutes decrease the cost of debt. Now, so all those papers seem to imply that there are real effects from those statutes. The BKT papers suggest that there are no real effects. And so there's a tension here. Not everybody can be right. So the bottom line, the evidence on constituency statutes seems to indicate that they may have some impact. The Q evidence would suggest that they have a positive impact. But now we also have evidence on the anti-takeover statutes that they can have a negative impact. The obvious question is, why do they have a positive impact if they do? Do corporate leaders really need a constituency statute to pay attention to stakeholders? Do they really need those statutes to be insulated from the takeover market? They seem to be doing pretty well when they want to without that. So we can turn back to Davos to reach the conclusion here. Now, we talked about kind of the stakeholder view of BKT. It seems to be quite narrower than the stakeholder view, certainly, of Davos. Now it seems to be more encompassing. And now Schwab is certainly not alone in this view. For many, stakeholder capitalism is about climate inequality and sustainability. Now there's this famous saying by Clausewitz that war is a continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means. Stakeholder capitalism might be the continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means, namely the corporations. So now in that sense, stakeholder capitalism tries to achieve societal goals. But now the corporations, as they are constituted now, now makes the world better by providing good products at low costs. You would think that competition would discipline them to do that well. It's really unclear how stakeholder capitalism in any of its forms can get those corporations to do that. So another concern is that supporters of stakeholder capitalism often want corporations to achieve what they can't achieve by political means. And the worry with that is that it will lead to inefficiency by having corporations focus on other things than what they're supposed to achieve. Additional concern, now my previous discussant, the previous discussant, and I seem to be the only discussant who doesn't have a beard, but the previous discussant talked about the obsession in the US with public corporations. But now, obviously, the more you impose things on corporations that they don't want to do, or that might not be good for them from the perspective of owners, the more you push corporations into leaving the public markets. We already have that problem of fewer and fewer public firms. And so it's a legitimate worry to think that more focused on social welfare from corporations through benefiting stakeholders and pursuing social goals could lead to a further decrease in public firms. So conclusions, allowing corporate leaders to take into account the interest of stakeholders does not mean that they will do so. That's a big lesson from the authors. But great corporations benefit society by being an engine for economic growth. We should make sure that they keep doing their job. Climate and inequality should be best addressed through other channels and governance. We can conclude by letting Burl have the last word. He responded to the Dodd paper. In his response, he said, "No, I submit that you cannot abandon emphasis on what we would call the shareholder maximization view until such time as you are prepared to offer a clear and reasonably enforceable scheme of responsibilities to someone else." We are not there. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. So I think, Lucian, are you going to handle the response?
Let me maybe just first of all thank Renee for the insightful comments, which are going to be very helpful to us in revising the paper. Few quick reactions. There was obviously a lot in Renee's presentation. One is, let me agree strongly with Renee's concluding line. Renee said that he believes that climate inequality, presumably other stakeholder interests, should be addressed through channels other than governance. And we fully agree with this. And indeed, this work and our other work, as well as some ongoing work, are intended to provide support for this proposition by showing that at least discretion-based governance mechanisms are not going to benefit those various societal interests and are going to be counterproductive in important ways. Going back to earlier in René's presentation, let me just offer quick reactions to some methodological issues that he raised. First, even though we stress the version of stakeholderism that we think is most important and consequentialist and consequential, our results also speak to other versions of stakeholderism. So take, for example, the version of stakeholderism that René talked about, enlightened stakeholder value, where we really care about shareholders, but in order to induce ex-ante investments by stakeholders, we have some implicit promises to treat stakeholders well exposed. This goes back, as many of you know, to Schleifer and Summers and so forth. Now, in our paper, we actually show that ex post, when the time comes to reward stakeholders for their ex-ante investments, corporate leaders do not seem to operate in a way that recognizes those implicit promises. It doesn't provide stakeholders at this crucial point in time of selling to a buyer any protections. Secondly, René was wondering whether the private equity sales setting is as useful as we think it is for testing this question. By the way, we did the same analysis for a sample of about 100 sales to strategic buyers, and we find similar patterns, namely practically no protection for stakeholders, and we have been debating internally whether to add it to an already long paper. But the reason why we think private equity is a good setting, and perhaps a very good setting, is that the risks are large for our stakeholders. And René was saying, look, but a main benefit, a main source of gains for private equity deals is that the buyer will have some freedom to break some things and to make big changes. And therefore, we fully agree with René that you wouldn't expect to see a deal that completely eliminates a discretion from the buyer. However, given that there are substantial gains because we see such large premiums going for the shareholders, it means that there is substantial surplus that for stakeholder-oriented leaders, you should expect to see those deals with slightly, at least with somewhat softer treatment of stakeholders and a somewhat softer, somewhat lower premium. You could have the same deal still go forward. The shareholders would get a somewhat lower premium and the stakeholders would get some protection. And the last comment that I'll react to is René was wondering maybe there is some protection in the form of implicit promises on the private equity buyer. The reason why we are skeptical is twofold. First of all, when it comes to the corporate leaders themselves, they get the promises explicitly. You could imagine easily they get implicit promises to keep them in their job, but no, that's written and hardwired into the contract big time with full detail. That's one thing. Secondly, it's easy to see, perhaps not a perfect, fully detailed aero debris treatment of all states, but there are some very simple protections that you could imagine. For example, suppose you just have protection that says, given that we expect that there is a risk of substantial layoff of employees, how about that employees that are being fired will get a certain amount of money and a nice gold watch? That can definitely happen and would soften the blow to fired employees, but we don't see anything of that nature in virtually all cases that we study. So let me stop here, and some of the other big picture issues will probably come up in the rest of the discussion.
Okay, so I'm just going to make one brief comment, and then there's a question in the chat, and then we'll go to the hands that are raising. And there's another set of data that is probative, or at least to some people. There are a bunch of event studies that were done on other constituency statutes, and that I think is useful maybe for your thesis. I would note that there's a more parsimonious explanation that the academic literature gave at the time, although it was just saying this was all rhetoric about stakeholders and that the point of these statutes were just to benefit managers so that they could prevent bids and benefit themselves. And I think your data actually show they're getting, that is consistent. They're getting big side payments, although we don't know whether that would also be true in non-other constituency states. I did look at your two companies that had stakeholder benefits, health, whatever, one with an H and the other one. And one had lower sort of benefits to the managers and shareholders on average, but the other was higher. So it doesn't say anything about the trade-off, but my event study that was multiple statutes had no significant price effects. And that would be consistent with shareholders thinking that it would be the results that you get in your paper. There were a couple of studies on individual statutes that had negative effects, but those are statutes that also had other provisions in them, like the Pennsylvania statute, so they're not directly related to that. But I think that might be, supportive of some aspects of the time would be like you, skeptical that it would have any impact. Let me read Jeff Gordon's question.
But a quick reaction. Can I offer a quick reaction? So we very much agree with this. So our findings, we think, are consistent with the evidence that you and some of the studies that René cited, but they just add a piece that comes from our.
Yes, I think your work is a great idea to look at this.
The agreement. So basically, there is all this literature starting with Romano and Mark Rhodes that documented that at the time there was lobbying by managers seeking to get entrenchment. And René was saying there are a lot of studies that find real effects, and those real effects might come from the entrenchment element. And in the literature, there are some people that think that insulation of managers from the marketplace is positive, some think it's negative, but there is obviously a piece there that is real. What we are adding is that consistent with the Romano and Roe view at the time, that this is not aimed at helping stakeholders, but rather managers. We looked with the benefit of hindsight, going all the way to the present, and looking at the deals, we document that indeed, up to this date, there is no use of this in the many deals we study to provide benefits to stakeholders.
So in the order of hands, I have Holger, Ernst, and then Jeff. Jeff had a question in chat that he put first. Is that what you want to ask, or Jeff? And I'll put him ahead of you other two, and then we'll move to Holger and Ernst.
Yeah, this is in follow-up from the claim that there were that the agreements as they found them were unenforceable. That there were in some cases there were the 1-year delay in layoffs, in some community protection. I mean, it seems to me that one could. The fact of enforceability doesn't mean that they don't have an effect. So the Davis et al. Study shows the average effect of layoffs and other employee effects across a broad sample of PE deals. And so one would want to, it seemed to me, compare the deals in which there were the protections that are allegedly unenforceable against the Davis et al. Results. And indeed, one might look in constituency statute states to see the employee effects for firms in those states as against the Davis et al. Average results for employee effects in PE deals in a general way, to see if the fact of enforceability in a legal sense might not limit the effect of the behavior change as we can observe it if you compare the the general run with these particular cases and the states more in a general way.
Jeff, thanks a lot. We need to clarify this and sharpen it in the paper, that there is this piece that we are pointing out, and lawyers, would enjoy it, that there are some that where you find limited protections, the agreements go out of their way to exclude enforceability. But the main point that underlies our conclusion is that the main thing that employees worry, being fired, for that, there are no provisions in 97% of the cases, so zero. So it's not that there is a limitation on firing and then it says that it's not enforceable. The lack of enforceability is only for those limited effect provisions that say that if you are not fired, for the first year, we are not going to change your salary, which is not such a big deal because it takes time for somebody to move in and to make changes. But basically, even before we go to enforceability, there is zero commitment not to fire you from moment zero, and there is zero commitment to reduce your compensation after 1 year. So the big effect, so the lack of enforceability, it's kind of the icing on the cake of our results, but the main dimension that makes it so little in terms of stakeholder protection is that there is just nothing there even before you get to enforceability.
Holger Smaman?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention in reaction to René's great comments that there may be a way to reconcile Lucian's and Kobe's and Roberto's findings with those other papers that René mentioned, which is that some of those old results, and I think showing generally that the effects, to the extent some were found, actually were the results of various errors in those papers, starting with Katan and Kahan 2016, reviewing some individual errors in some papers, but then more systematically Karpov and Vidri in the JF 2018, showing that it's very important to control for various other things that happen at the same time, because these laws were all enacted sort of simultaneously. And then my paper with Alan Hu that we gave at the AFA this year, showing that there's a big issue in how you calculate your standard errors, so inference in these papers, a very big issue. And a paper by Andrew Baker was summarizing the recent application of these panel models, the fixed effects. And all of these papers sort of conclude, I think, Karpov and Vidri not as forcefully, but the other three of these laws, constituency statutes included, actually don't hold up. And I don't say that to criticize those old papers. Obviously, we're making progress and that's all great, but that just maybe is a way to reconcile these findings, and then we don't have to get hung up in, you know, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. No, I think the evidence actually in that sense is pretty consistent that there was no effect.
Thanks, Holger. So we need to think about this, but the point is well taken. Our position on this would be that whether or not there is an effect of the kind that was documented in earlier papers, but you are saying might not be there after the new papers, is that whatever effect was there might have had to do with insulation with market forces, which we know from a large body of financial economics might have an effect in one direction or another. And what we're trying to do is just a narrow test of the direct effect ex post on keeping promises explicit or implicit to provide stakeholder protection.
Ernst?
Yes, thank you. Very nice paper, Roberto and Lucian. Interesting, really. There's something that I was wondering about. I mean, we know that PE acquisitions are often quite different from, let's say, tender offers or standard takeovers. So these are different, not just different people, but these are also different cases very often. In fact, in Europe, it's quite often the case that PE acquisitions are basically the last remedy before bankruptcy. Firms that are in dire straits and are taken over by some PE people who then try to turn it around. If that is indeed the case, which is a specific situation, then it may in fact be that the alternative to not having an acquisition is even worse than continuing and keeping the promises, namely bankruptcy. So in that sense, it would be interesting what it means to break those implicit promises that you were discussing, because it might well be that at least for some firms, these promises would have to be broken in any case through bankruptcy. So do you have information about the background situation of those firms, and how does that sort of fit into the overall framework of what alternatives or outside options would have been?
Okay, thanks a lot for this. That's related to the discussion that René and I had before about the private equity setting. So two things. One is we have information about our deals. There is also information about the universe as a whole from the work by Steve Kaplan and others. And in our sample, many of those deals are not of firms in financial distress. They are actually quote unquote cash cows that enable the private equity buyer to finance this substantially with debt. However, even in cases where your account might be very accurate, our claim is not that they should not have sold to a private equity buyer that is going to have those high-powered incentives to maximize the bottom line. Our point is different. We are saying if you are stakeholder-oriented, you should still do the deal. There is, on average, 30% premium to be pocketed. That's the size of the pie. And you would say it's an economic series, but that's the pie. It can be divided in many different ways among all the stakeholders in the company. And we are saying if you look at the deal terms, you see that the full 30% is allocated to the shareholders. Some surplus is given to the executives themselves through continued employment and bonuses. The employees and all the other stakeholders do not get anything extra beyond kind of the hardwired entitlements they have to begin with. And we are saying, if you are stakeholder oriented, why don't you do a deal in which you throw a little, maybe some amount or at least some crumbs? We don't even see crumbs going for the other stakeholders. And that's rather than not having the deal is what we would expect to see, but we don't see in the transactions.
So I'm not sure if Ron still has his question. So let me ask another question. I'm thinking about, when these statutes were adopted, it was many years ago in a different environment for acquisitions than we have today. So I'm wondering, is the reason why you decided to look at current ones because you think managers today should be more sensitive to stakeholder issues than they were in the past? And that relates to another question. I thought it was a very nice idea to look at this, but one might say sort of it's an end game. These managers are exiting. If we don't think they're going to show up as public company CEOs thereafter, then they might not be as sensitive to these issues or care about them compared to people who are in current positions. And so I'm wondering what you think about, in terms of that kind of comparison, right? I mean, I tend to agree with you that the incentive contracts of current executives are also currently geared mainly to stock appreciation, although some companies that apparently are changing them to have some ESG component. But what do you think about that? If that was what a stakeholder objection might be to your.
Right. So there are two insights in what you say. The second one says, look, maybe there's another way in which your results don't extend in general to the debate, not because of the private equity versus strategic deals, but just the acquisition context, because it's a final period, it's an end point. At that point, maybe they behave differently, and in the ongoing enterprise, they might be much more, quote unquote, stakeholder friendly and so forth. We think that actually it might go in the opposite direction. Why? Because we all recognize that's something that we stressed in the illusory promise, but we stress also in this paper, and then many people here recognize that in the ongoing enterprise, they are concerned, there is pressure from the shareholders because the shareholders cast the votes. And if they don't like what you are doing now, if you are maybe not pursuing enough profits, maybe they'll vote you out in a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, when activists will come knocking down. Now, in a way, this final period situation enables corporate leaders to treat stakeholders nicely if they want to, and that's the question, without fear of how shareholders will deal with them 2 or 3 years down the road. Obviously, they have to worry about shareholders voting in favor of this deal, but often this is not a binding constraint because the premium is very large. It's 30%. And we find that even when the acquisition vote is approved by a very large margin, they don't do anything for the stakeholders. And obviously they could just offer 25%, the shareholders would still vote in favor. So in a way, if corporate leaders do want, whether it's because of norms, whether it's because of culture, whether it's because they've read enough stakeholder risk articles, for whatever reason, if they want to do it, in a way, this final period, which, you know, in your work and in the work of many people, we worry that they have more agency problems in the final period. But that also means that in that period, they are relatively freer to treat stakeholders nicely if they want to. And therefore, this, I think, supports more strongly the view that we cannot really count on them to want to protect stakeholders beyond what would be good for shareholders and their own interests.
Marco Beck?
So you could be wrong, but you could also be right. So let's assume you're right. Then the question is, you know, why do we have these things in the first place? So that's one question. But then if you're a stakeholderist, you would say, well, okay, these things don't work. What else do we have to put in place? And, you know, that would then be the kind of question. So, you know, is that an implication of your paper? I mean, does the US then need German co-determination, 50% of the board appointed by the employees to get them that share of the pie? Or do we need an arbitration panel? I mean, clearly the directors here, if you're right, that they're not doing the job. So what would a stakeholderist have to do in order to make sure that the employees get their fair share in these buyouts?
Great. Delighted that you have this question because it brings us full circle to some of the big picture observations that René started with. So why do we have those things? With respect to the constituency statutes, I think Roberta Romano and Mark Rowe suggested way back when those things were adopted that they were really aimed at helping insulation and entrenchment. We think that this evidence supports it. Why do we now have the push for stakeholder capitalism that René described so clearly in his presentation? It's obviously going all over the world, from the slopes of Davos to the halls, to the business halls of Manhattan. We think that it happens today because there is a big pressure in the world. People understand that we have problems with corporate externalities. So there's a big pressure to do something about it. Plus, there's a big pressure on shareholders, and therefore their desire for insulation is strong. And we think that we completely agree with René that corporate leaders are responding to those pressures. But the way we see it, that things like Davos and the Business Roundtable statement, they take this pressure and when they offer in response a discretion-based mechanism for dealing with it, they do two things. One is they deflect the pressure to do something real for stakeholders. And two, they gain some insulation from the marketplace on grounds that if you insulate us and let us focus on stakeholders, we'll do the social job, which is something that corporate leaders have long wanted. Which brings us to the last question of what should we do? And this enables me to say on behalf of myself and Roberto and Kobe that we are actually stakeholder-friendly people. We consider ourselves as deeply concerned about stakeholders. I mean, there are two kinds of views among people who criticize stakeholder capitalism. There is the old-fashioned Milton Friedman view. The market is working perfectly, society is working perfectly, shareholders own the thing, that's it. Our view is that indeed, corporate externalities are a substantial problem in the world, but stakeholder capitalism, as long as it's discretion-based, is going to have illusory benefits, and it's going to be counterproductive because it will deflect pressure to do something real, and it will insulate managers. We would like to see real reforms. So to return to René's focus on climate change, our position is that, and we think that our evidence provides an epsilon in support of this, is that if we rely on corporate leaders to help address climate change, the icebergs are going to melt before this mechanism is going to help us. And what we need is for anyone who cares about this problem to adopt real measures like carbon tax or what have you, that would affect corporate leaders directly by changing their standard economic incentives. And it's exactly because we are deeply concerned about externalities with respect to stakeholders. We think that demonstrating that stakeholder governance is going to produce illusory benefits is so important. And since I don't have, let me just say 2 sentences about, Marcus said, maybe the solution is, and René had in his last slide, changing incentives. In the elusive promise, we have a part that says, look, maybe we could leave it not just to discretion, we could change incentives by changing compensation arrangements to bring in ESG metrics, or maybe we should elect stakeholders to the board. And we explain why we think this would not work and would have substantial costs. And if any of you reads this and tells us, we'll send them a bouquet of flowers in gratitude.
So let's collect the last 2 questions and then give Lucian you respond. So that way we'll just be a little over before our lunch break. So the last 2 questioners are Jeff and Ron, Jeff Gordon, and then Ron Gilson.
Right. So really, in a sense, this is to pick up on Marco's question, which is to say, are there changes in the governance setup that one could imagine in which the constituency statutes might be effective, for example, or in which other pressures would lead managers to seek the protections that don't presently exist. And so one area that I think could well be re-examined are golden parachutes, which I think give managers high-powered incentives, not only to negotiate the best deal from a share price point of view, because they benefit along with the shareholders, but actively give managers incentives to seek out deals. Because the fact of exit is a chance when the CEOs and the management team can get truly rich. And so I think golden parachutes, which were once in effect a buyout of the CEOs the CEOs takeover resistance endowment, sort of a necessary cost in a regime in which the board had little power over the CEO, today has become a positive incentive to seek out deals, even deals where the cost to the stakeholders might be very considerable, but where the gains to management, just because of the golden parachutes, is what's driving the deal in the first place. So that's a potential reform dimension that might be pursued.
It's easy to show that I think that Lucian's construction of the constituency statutes are right in the sense that they just don't do anything. The joke is stakeholders are worth $3 a share, and then you don't have to give it to them. But the easy move at that point, that worry that I'm playing with now, is the reference that, oh, well, the legislator, the political process ought to address this. Well, what I recall from the constituency period, the one statute that actually worked wasn't the constituency statute at all. The gains from a lot of the acquisitions were taking textile plants and moving them to the south. And Maine adopted a statute that simply said it was a plant closing statute. If you closed the plant within a period of time, you owed employees money. Didn't care why you closed the plant. If it was stakeholders we were concerned about stakeholders, whether it was current management who did them in or the next set of management. But then, Roberta, your work on the legislative process associated with anti-takeover stuff pretty much left one unhappy about the legislature and the notion. I look around, maybe New Zealand works, but it's a little hard to point to any other political process at the moment that we think is going to be particularly good about it. So that the discussion goes a long way towards saying constituency statutes were both hypocritical and as a result failed. But there's less work, or almost none that I can think of, that's looking at how a legislature would actually address this. That is, you'd start by trying to identify in particular takeover waves where the potential gain was coming out of the stakeholders' pockets, and then you'd address those. But those are going to change constantly. And as we know, the legislative process lends itself to petrification. So we've got a bunch of different processes. The adjective in front of it is going to be enlightened. We're going to find somebody we want to give discretion to. We're going to add enlightened before that group, and we're going to rely somehow trusting them that they'll do it right. I don't see much work that, in part because I can't imagine an outcome in which we're trying to identify a process in the real world in which this kind of balancing can be done when we're confident that it won't be manipulated for the self-interest of those who have the discretion. So the first step is easy, and it's easy to agree with. The second step, which is probably third best or fourth best, seems to me really hard to address, and part of the reason why the issue just won't go away.
Lucian, the last word to you. Why don't you take about 5 minutes or so, because we're running a little over. Although I think most people will stay and respond to both Jeff and Ron.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. Obviously not the last word in this debate. So
just for today.
For the next 5 minutes. So first of all, with respect to Ron, we very much share your view that if you care about employees in acquisitions, the best way to deal with it is with legislation that would provide them with rights in the event of plant relocation, rather than counting on corporate leaders to add such provisions in deal terms. And similarly, if you worry about the iceberg, you should have carbon tax and not count on corporate leaders to do something in this respect. Now, the other thing that you said, Ron, and we heard it from various people, I think, including Jeff, when we first presented this work in his class, is there are many people who just have some despair about the ability of the political process to deal with stakeholderism, stakeholder externalities. And look, if you have, and people often say there is gridlock, there are vested interests and so forth. If you are indeed so pessimistic, I don't know that there is that much to do. What you can do is just move from Manhattan, far from the shores, because we are not going to address climate change with discretion-based stakeholder capitalism. Now, we are perhaps mistakenly, we are more optimistic. We think that there are avenues that things can happen. And we think that on some margin, people having realistic expectations about private ordering, not solving things without big ticket regulation, is going to help getting the reforms needed. But going to Jeff's point, briefly, we try to explain the illusory promise why it's difficult to fix incentives by redesigning executive pay arrangements. You mentioned, let's play with golden parachutes. So various people in this room have worked on executive compensation over many years, and we see that even trying to design the best executive pay arrangement just to maximize shareholder interest is not that easy, and there are various problems. Now, once you're saying, let's try to get it designed so that we maximize the interest of stakeholders in general, if you do things that like we can go in parachutes or do other things, you can do it in one of two ways. Either you can weaken the power of incentives to favor shareholders, or give affirmative incentives to help stakeholders. Diluting the incentives to help shareholders just sends us back to a period in which we were all critical about pay without performance and the like. So you might say, let's give them affirmative incentives to serve stakeholders. We have reviewed the various arrangements that companies have in place when they try to work in some ESG metrics, and we see two problems. One is very often it's just like a narrow slice of stakeholder interests. So it gets us to the big distortions of multitasking. And secondly, since we are all aware that there is a big agency problem with executive compensation, so we need to have pay arrangements that can be reviewed by shareholders. All the ESG metrics that we have seen and that we can think about are such that it's very difficult for outsiders to review and figure out whether this is something that is providing meaningful incentives rather than being used to provide payoffs to executives with little performance either for shareholders or for stakeholders. So from the work we have done, and obviously this is not the last word of it, and we hope people will do work, but our impression from the work we have done is that it's very difficult to see how we can design ESG grounded metrics that would improve performance towards a stakeholder oriented objective, rather than just be used to increase executive payoffs without improving performance for anyone. Thanks a lot, Jeff.